blocking everybody off, so I can't, you know.
Martial law is coming. This is the way I see it. It's going to be quarantine, wellness check, confiscation, that's a progression I see.
So if you're sick, are they going to search you and take everything from you?
Quite possibly.
To quote unquote sanitize it and you.
Yep, exactly.
I got a question for both of you.
What's up?
I know lots and lots of young folk, myself partially included, not want some money. I know some minors that are just going out for birthday money. Their parents aren't doing nothing. So what do you think the steps would be for them to prep?
I don't know, man.
Prep.
About what food you can.
See the future for what it's going to become and prep. That's all I can say. Food, water, medicine, defense. Those are the basics.
Yeah, we're gonna, I don't know, man. I just hope that a lot of good people don't die and all the families are safe. But yet at the same time, economic collapse does happen and it'll give some benefit to people that want to make the country good again.
What's called a civilizational index. There's nowhere else to go but down. Rich. At least he was told this one. It's at apex. There's nowhere else to go but down. With barbarians, famine, plague. Shit goes down, but it'll also come back up. You just got to ride that road.
Look how you use it.
Exactly.
Have faith in God. Don't take the mark of the beast if it is that kind of thing.
Yeah, that is some weird shit right there. All of a sudden, they're wanting to damn ship everybody and make sure we're all part of the global community. That's some scary nonsense right there.
Dude, it's like a globalist. It's like they're shutting down the whole world so the globalists can actually take control with their FEMA camps and martial law.
Yeah, that's what I'm going to do. You know. People all work out. These humans like themselves with enough time. All I can say is be prepared, be safe, be aware of the situation around you.
Our ham radio is accessible at the moment.
I wish I had a ham radio.
I need some walkie-talkies. Are walkie-talkies easily hacked by officials?
Walkie-talkies have a good degree, so depending on what they would have to be in your area to access it. Yeah. I've got walkie-talkies where the max range is 5 miles. You have to be within that 5 miles to access them, to hear what is being said.
Monkey, I know how it is, man. My girl was living in California for a while. She was worried about how it was there, and then I finally got her out of that area. Just keep a can of, like a spray bottle, like lightly, a little bit of bleach and water and stuff.
Yeah.
Spray stuff down, and you gotta go somewhere if you got to.
A mix of my observation, 70% alcohol at night and aloe vera, the gel, makes a decent hand sanitizer. And if you want to boost your immune system with oregano and elderberry. That's what we're taking.
Is everybody just freaked out right now? Is that what's going on?
But my wife is sober. She knows all about this shit. And she's like, you need to be taking oregano, which is antiviral. It boosts your antiviral immune system. And elderberry is good for the rest of
Elderberry is so yummy. That's the yummiest thing ever.
Yeah. Elderberry is really good for the system.
It grows everywhere, I think. Like most places around here.
Boost the respiratory system, the immune system. You don't have to worry about this shit. I just sit here and ask, the better off your immune system is, the better off you are.
I don't know though, man. It is kind of weird to me that they would care so much. The weirdest thing is that they would care so much, quote unquote, about the public and actually make it such a big deal to shut everything down like this. Like, that's what's weird to me, is that they would even let this happen. They're acting like they'll do anything to save us, and that sounds to me like they're about to get some kind of feely camp thing going for people that are Christian or white or traditional or right wing.
Well, they've been talking about throwing us in camps for months and years now.
Talk about Operation Zephyr.
I don't want to talk about that. I don't really know that much about it.
Oh, I do.
What do you know about it?
Alright,
You're going to have to speak up. Can anybody hear her?
Barely.
Yeah, apparently. Nobody can hear you.
okay, so basically it's like this thing that there was this like Jewish dude named David Goldberg, and he was talking about this like project called like Project Zephyr. It says that Israel estimates that 7 to 15% of Americans are awake to the truth about Zionism, and it concerns them, and there's like more people who are realizing it and then running off the GQ and stuff. And their plan is to identify people and control the opposition YouTube channels and boards like 4chan. And this dude, David Goldberg, accurately reported from reading classified documents that they would engineer a flu-like virus that would infect millions of people and serve as a cover for the extermination of people they deem to be a threat to the world order. And they have localized and nationwide blackouts that last for a few days and use these opportunities to invade homes and kill people who are on the list or put them in a FEMA camp. And the pandemic also served the purpose of collapsing the global economy and the dissolution of the U.S. in order to introduce the one world government with Jerusalem as a capital. And there's a video of this dude talking about it, so you know it's real. I can put the video in the chat.
So, have a bag, be ready to go, be ready to live on the land if all else gets bad.
I know what she's talking about. I just had a friend of mine tell me about that. In California, they have already had those blackouts, and there have been guys that have been killed that have been far right.
Oh, really?
I remember the blackouts. I was there when some of them happened. Those power outages that they blamed on the wildfires.
Wildfires, yeah.
I remember that very much.
Oh God, should we continue? They're gonna want us to shut it down.
Okay.
Oh, you guys, our plans are coming into effect, Herschel. We've got to take over the Goyim.
I'm ready at all times when I don't have a loaded weapon on me. I carry a knife on me. Anyone comes near me.
And I'll tell you this, if any sickos in this New World Order does start doing anything fucked up and they try to get a hold of you, or, once they get a hold of you and they could torture you, I wouldn't want that to happen. Let's just say that. So be wary of,
exposition. So a giant World Fair in Chicago, and I started looking at the photographs. And in fact, I would recommend for those of you out there watching, because I can't really show much. I can show you like a cover of the book, for example, with a photo on it. But you might want to go and just Google search Columbian Exposition 1893 and pull up some photos for yourself, or the other things we're going to talk about that might help you to see what we're saying. But when I looked at the buildings, it was like I'm looking at ancient Rome. Like I'm looking at like pristine, almost ancient Roman buildings, and once I dug into it and found out there were 700 acres of these things, and then they did them in Philadelphia, and Buffalo, and St. Louis, and New York, and Paris, and Milan, and Sydney, and Melbourne. Everywhere in the world had one of these giant fairs, all supposedly built in record amounts of time, and then this was the part that was the most insane. As soon as it was over, they blew them up with dynamite and threw them in the garbage. And that's how I got started.
Yeah, so we're talking about the World Fairs that we go all around the United States, and I have a cat now that's bothering me. Hang on here. All right, cat.
And mine's sleeping, so cool.
Was this Shocky? Hey! 10 years old. She was born on the day that Fukushima happened. Okay, so these World Fairs were built and they were elaborate. And one of the places that they had them was actually the town that I grew up in, Omaha, Nebraska. And I did not know about, I'd heard, my mom had a cup that said Omaha World's Fair on it. I remember that. I remember not being taught anything in school about it. Then your book spurred me on because I said there was a World's Fair in Omaha. So I started looking it up, and I saw the buildings that were unbelievable. And you have to understand, Omaha's, no offense to Omaha, but it was a cow town. And there's this World Fair, and then I find out that 2 million people in the 1890s came to Omaha to see the World's Fair. And I'm trying to imagine, the trains and 2 million people. This is the biggest event in Omaha's history. It's not talked about. It's not mentioned. It's not taught to kids in school. This is like, the Beatles or something, right? It's so big. And yet it's not talked about. And then they tore it down, just like you said, they tore down this incredibly elaborate city with boats and buildings and Greco-Roman style buildings and pillars, and I did not even know about it, to be honest with you, until your book made me go down that rabbit hole. And then that got me thinking about when I was in Omaha. I left in the early 70s, but in the early 70s I was living in the downtown area, and the building I lived in was this elaborate, ornate building that was abandoned for the most part. There was just a bunch of hippies and artists that lived in it, and they had 14-foot ceilings. The door was 12 feet tall. It was incredibly ornate, and as I lived in that building, I watched all the ornate buildings that were in the neighborhood being torn down, and by 1973, they had all been torn down, including the building that I was in. It got condemned and torn down, and for the life of me, I could never figure out why they were tearing down these buildings. They were perfectly good buildings. They were beautiful buildings. They were strange, though. They didn't really seem to serve a purpose and efficiency. The doors were way too big. The windows were way too big. So you got me down this rabbit hole where I'm thinking, what is going on here? So what were they doing? Tell me what you think they were doing. Okay, let's go to the World's Fair in Chicago first. There's 700 acres, 40,000 workers, in 2 years built this thing, right?
Now that's the story. So let's examine, and what I'm trying to do with the book or with any of these talks is just try to dig through the historical narrative the way we're presented and try to show why that narrative is probably completely false. Right? So it's very difficult to say, and I've got the answer. I can only give some theories down the road, which we'll get to. But when I started looking into the fair, so like you say, 700 acres just in Chicago, and the buildings are massive. The manufacturer's building could hold 300,000 people. It was the largest building in the world at the time. And then you've got another 40 buildings just like it, towers, domes, massive construction project. Each country had its own building. Each state of the union had its own building. Then you had a midway. Then you had, and at the same time, as if that's not a big enough building project, Chicago built the University of Chicago right next door at the same time, and 2 other giant building projects in downtown.
And lakes and bridges.
So I went to a building contractor that I know, and I just said, okay, can you build this for me today? Well, yeah, I said, that's going to be one hell of a project. I said, well, how, if you have unlimited money, unlimited budget, modern machines, how long does this take you? He said, well, it's going to take me 2 years just for the planning of this, because there's so many things you have to do with dealing with the landscaping and the building of these lakes and the canals and everything. So 2 years for that. It'll be 2 years to build the canals and the waterways and the road systems. And then give or take 8 to 10 years for the buildings, if I have like about 100,000 man workforce. And then I told him, okay, this is the Chicago World's Fair. They're supposed to have done it in 1891 in 2 years. His response was, that's not possible. It's not possible. Like, this is the guy who does it for a living. And then I started showing, and then amazing, I showed him the construction photos of things like the World Fair, or the World's Fair in St. Louis, which is one of the best to show construction photos of. Because what you have is complete buildings with scaffolding on the side, 1 or 2 guys standing below with a ladder, and absolutely nothing else around it. Now, again, this guy has eyes of a construction worker, so he's saying, well, where's the pile of materials that you're going to need to build? Well, where's the bathrooms for these guys who are going to go to the bathroom? Where's like a discarded sandwich or a coffee cup on the ground? He said, this is very clear. No one's been here for like a couple of years. So all of these things, this information just made it even more strange of what we were looking at.
Yeah, I look and it's frustrating because I can't find any pictures of the construction of the Chicago World's Fair or the Omaha World's Fair. Right?
Yeah, I got some. You have to really know where to look. Like, it took me, it was almost like a month just to find the right photographs. There, most of them are dubious. So I'll give you my theory of where we might go with this, because it'll tie into the cathedrals that you've studied, it'll tie into everything, right? Which is, well, I think, well, of course, you've got 10 different possible scenarios, right? From wild things like they were built in a parallel reality or aliens built them. But if we take it down to the 2 most logical possibilities, the one logical is that they did actually build this in 2 years. They claim it was because they were built with temporary materials called staff, and that's why it was supposed to have been built so quickly. But still, like my building contractor said, that's 10 to 15 years. You can't. And when you look at the buildings, you're noticing that there's much more stone. There's more work than that. And so it either means that A had a technology that they're not supposed to have, and they were able to build. Because even just think of bringing all the materials onto the site with horse and buggy. How can you even bring the materials there? Yeah, so that's one theory. They've got a technology that they're not supposed to have, and we don't know what happened to. The other side, the other theory is that the buildings had already been built and had been there for a long, long time, hundreds, maybe thousands of years, part of an ancient civilization that we weren't supposed to know about. And you might say they just cleaned them up, fixed them, repainted them. That was the famous thing of the Chicago World's Fair, that they supposedly invented this new type of spray paint where they could whitewash, and that's the name they use, whitewash. They could whitewash all the buildings. And my feeling is that if I'm leading to a theory, my guess is they probably had maybe 50 buildings already there from a long time ancient civilization. And then they did actually build some temporary structures around it for the rest of the fair, whitewashed it all with the same paint, and you couldn't tell the difference between one and the other.
Wow. And I know that is shocking to think about. And I cannot. I have looked for diaries or any kind of memoirs. I can't find any about there already being buildings there. Same thing in Omaha. That's the theory. So I can't find anything that substantiates the theory outside of thousands of photographs. That's the problem with this whole thing. Since
There is some linking to that in very early historical texts, kind of before the fairs. There's sort of an indication in some of the early explorers that they were reaching these giant cities and these giant places that people sort of took to be, well, they must be in an Aztec city, they must be in a city, an old Mayan city. No one could possibly determine that. Maybe what they're talking about is things like what happened in San Francisco or St. Louis or Buffalo. And what's really intriguing about it is that I think one of the big things these fairs were doing, because all the fairs lost money, like a lot of money. None of them made money at all. Lost millions of dollars at the time, yet they kept having them. I think a big part of this was creating the very history that you and I have been taught since we were kids. It was invented at these fairs and presented at these fairs as this is the history, whatever you're calling the new population going forward, and whatever that new population is compared to the old one, this is the story you're going to believe.
Yeah, and when you look at population changes in, say, the 1850s, it's actually astonishing. New York lost 75% of its population from 1850 to 1860. They moved out, but then they maintained their population because that many people moved in, mostly from Europe. My family moved to the United States from both Ireland and Germany at that time. So my family was part of that wave coming in. And then they stayed for just a brief time in New York City, and then they went and got, because they were giving land away, they got a farm in Illinois, right? And then later they branched out to other places. But so there's this, and then there's the orphan trains, which are another odd thing going on in the 1850s, where they're moving hundreds of thousands of children essentially out of the east into the west, and where they're going is extremely dubious. We don't know where these children went. It looks like slave labor almost.
Yeah, and where they came from, who really were their parents, what happened to their parents. And then the other thing at the same time that's going on is the supposed building of these giant insane asylums.
That's right.
When you look at these things, they are like, they're bigger than the Medici palaces I would see in Florence, and more beautifully built. So, why do you need 10,000 insane asylums all over the country, making them look absolutely beautiful, and who are you putting in them? Who is actually going, who is now all of a sudden insane, so many, and I'm wondering if it's the people, adults who still remember the old world, that needed to be put away.
Yeah, or they were talking about it, or, they probably got the whole idea, they just went silent, and that would save their life, and not be taken into the insane asylums. Not be taken into the insane asylums. It's very interesting. Google insane asylums 1800 and Google images, and
exactly, you won't believe what you're going to look at. Like, I mean, they're beautiful. They are, and a lot of this stuff that we're talking about, the beauty of the building and the construction of the building, is more to me than it's not just to look nice. It's built with extreme sacred geometry. It's built with extreme combinations. And all of these ancient buildings are built like machines. And I get the sense that the same as if you're in an ancient pyramid, the same if you're in an ancient temple, these were sort of like an updated version of those older structures, but they were all energetic machines, each one of them.
Yeah, we know from when NASA did their tether experiment on the space shuttle that there's electricity everywhere. Plasma, you might call it. A better way to understand it would be that we're surrounded by an ocean of plasma. And that Tesla knew that if you stuck a tower up, you could gather that up and everybody would have free electricity. And Fontanelli intimates in The Mystery of the Cathedral that the towers of the cathedral were bringing down some kind of energy, he calls it telluric forces, that would register down on the floor, and there was always a labyrinth right there. The Catholic Church took the labyrinths out of almost all the cathedrals. I think Chartres has one left. And you would walk around the labyrinth with these because energy's coming down, and they would put the cathedrals at the top of the highest hill in every village, so that the energy would come down from the hill down into the village. And even Schwaller Delulich says that the cathedrals were really what caused the Enlightenment in Europe, because before that the church had outlawed reading and writing, and you had to know how to read and write and do math to build, churches and stuff. But the origins of these cathedrals, like these world fairs, are also murky, incredibly.
Exactly. Exactly.
And I'll even go further. Yesterday, as I was researching for this show, I went to a channel by a guy called Autodidactic, and he had pictures from the 1860s here in California, in the United States, but in California, of dilapidated cathedrals. 1860s, there's dilapidated, fully built, but now falling into ruin cathedrals here in California and Arizona. And I mean, it would take 100 years to build, and maybe just for a little while, it would take at least 100 years to fall apart. So we're talking that cathedral was built, 1500s? And the Spanish weren't into building cathedrals. They built adobe houses. Their missions were made out of adobe, and later they added brick. But, we do it on the quick and on the fly. So it doesn't... This is the most amazing reality breaker of all. What we're saying is that America had already been occupied by an advanced civilization. Right. And the question is, was it here when the white people arrived from Europe? Or had it been here for a long time? We don't know, do we?
No, that's a really good question. I mean, it's the information seems to indicate that's true, that there was something quite large here. You can infer it in certain old texts and the way that things are talked, and in some of the early discussions of the Cherokee or certain other tribes, what happened to them, where they were, and why they would dress in sort of European gowns, and of course very Roman toga-like looks. You can see lots of big statues of George Washington right in a toga. And you have to wonder, well, who is really George Washington and the founding fathers? Because the weird thing we get, that you would know very well from reading the book and whatnot, is in the 1800s, particularly from the mid-1800s on, every single city in North America goes through a giant unexplained fire. Where when you look at the photographs of the cities after the fire, it doesn't look like any fire I've ever seen. It looks like Dresden after 10 days of bombing, with brick and stone buildings literally sliced in half, and you have to start to wonder, are we looking at the remnants of some sort of warfare that happened whenever, but it was continent-wide? And so all of these things that you see, that we're lucky to have some photographic record of this time period to look in and start questioning that the narrative can't be true. It looks like Dresden after 10 days of bombing, with brick and stone buildings literally sliced in half, and you have to start to wonder, are we looking at the remnants of some sort of warfare that happened whenever, but it was continent-wide? And so all of these things that you see, that we're lucky to have some photographic record of this time period to look in and start questioning that the narrative can't be true. Because there's so many parts that are contradictory to it. It looks like Dresden after 10 days of bombing, with brick and stone buildings literally sliced in half, and you have to start to wonder, are we looking at the remnants of some sort of warfare that happened whenever, but it was continent-wide? And so all of these things that you see, that we're lucky to have some photographic record of this time period to look in and start questioning that the narrative can't be true. Because there's so many parts that are contradictory to it. It looks like Dresden after 10 days of bombing, with brick and stone buildings literally sliced in half, and you have to start to wonder, are we looking at the remnants of some sort of warfare that happened whenever, but it was continent-wide. And so all of these things that you see, we're lucky to have some photographic record of this time period to look in and start questioning the narrative can't be true. Because there's so many parts that are contradictory to it. It looks like Dresden after, 10 days of bombing, with brick and stone buildings literally sliced in half, and you have to start to wonder, are we looking at the remnants of some sort of warfare that happened whenever, but it was continent-wide? And so all of these things that you see, we're lucky to have some photographic record of this time period to look in and start questioning the narrative can't be true. Because there's so many parts that are contradictory to it. It looks like Dresden after, 10 days of bombing, with brick and stone buildings literally sliced in half, and you have to start to wonder, are we looking at the remnants of some sort of warfare that happened whenever, but it was continent-wide? And so all of these things that you see, we're lucky to have some photographic record of this time period to look in and start questioning the narrative can't be true. Because there's so many parts that are contradictory to it. It looks like Dresden after, 10 days of bombing, with brick and stone buildings literally sliced in half, and you have to start to wonder, are we looking at the remnants of some sort of warfare that happened whenever, but it was continent-wide? And so all of these things that you see, we're lucky to have some photographic record of this time period to look in and start questioning the narrative can't be true. Because there's so many parts that are contradictory to it. It looks like Dresden after, 10 days of bombing, with brick and stone buildings literally sliced in half, and you have to start to wonder, are we looking at the remnants of some sort of warfare that happened whenever, but it was continent-wide? And so all of these things that you see, we're lucky to have some photographic record of this time period to look in and start questioning the narrative can't be true. Because there's so many parts that are contradictory to it. It looks like Dresden after, 10 days of bombing, with brick and stone buildings literally sliced in half, and you have to start to wonder, are we looking at the remnants of some sort of warfare that happened whenever, but it was continent-wide? And so all of these things that you see, we're lucky to have some photographic record of this time period to look in and start questioning the narrative can't be true. Because there's so many parts that are contradictory to it. It looks like Dresden after, 10 days of bombing, with brick and stone buildings literally sliced in half, and you have to start to wonder,